Welcome to another exciting episode of Baseball Now in our newly remodeled Cash and Sports Studio 44. As always, I am your host, Scotty. We had an interesting week last week. We had a couple of big blowouts, and it was the first week that there is no deals that could be made. As a reminder, the trade deadline has passed, so moving forward, the only way you could add or subtract players is by the waiver wire. So we won't have that segment tonight with Thomas talking about what's coming up on trades. But we've got a jam-packed show for you tonight with Thomas's weekly rewind, his look ahead, and his playoff preview, and of course, as always, his who's hot, who's not. Along at the very end with our weekly power rankings. So sit back and enjoy because we've got a jam-packed show. So Thomas, I'm going to send it down to you in that Atlanta studio. Take it away.
All right, thank you, Scott. Let's go ahead and take a look at that Week 17 recap. For the first one, you've got the Georgia Dominators. That's myself at 590 points this week. Did not lead the league in points. That would be Dan at just a little crazy at 605. But you had the Dominators at 590, and you had the Making Chili Dogs. That's Ken at 317, a low point for him this year on his scoring. The Dominators moved to 10-7, and the Chili Dogs moved to 7-10. Let's go and take a look at the top performers this week. Lindor at 59 for the Dominators, Marte at 53, and Schwallenbach at 48. For the Chili Dogs, Witt at 34, Ohtani at 34, and Soler at 32 points this week. Let's take a look at a sibling rivalry. You have the Wildcats at 496 points. That's Tammy. Over the Demon Duck Lindsay's, that's Greg, 414. The Demon Ducks fall to 11-6, while the Wildcats move to 9-7-1. Pay attention to that 1 on the end of that record. That will be very crucial coming up. Let's go and look at the top performers for this game. For the Wildcats, you've got Skubal at 60, Guerrero at 47, and the newly acquired Scherzer at 37. For Greg's team, you got Profar at 57, Chapman at 37, and Schwarber at 37 points. Now let's take a look at the next game. Just a little crazy. That's Dan, 605 points, as he moves to 10-6-1. Over the Gatlinburg Cubs, 356 points. He moves down to 4-13. That's a pretty good butt whooping that the Cubs took this week at the hands of Dan's team, but not quite unusual for Scotty when he goes against Dan. That's pretty occurring for him to get his butt whooped. Let's take a look at the performers for Dan and Scotty. For Dan, you have Ober at 77, you have Green at 64, and you have Miller at 53. Very high totals this week. For Scotty's team, the Cubs, you've got Soto at 53, Keller at 46, and Evaldi at 40 points. And let's take a look at the next game on the schedule. You had the Warner Robin Bombers, that's Jackson, scoring 466 points this week as he wins yet again. And he is on a roll, let me tell you, folks. He moves to 7-10. Over the Atlanta Express, that's Ruben, as he is in a downward slide. If you got the tale of two different teams, one going up and one going down. The Express, 441. Ruben's now at 9-8 on the year. Let's go ahead and take a look at the top performers. Anderson for Jackson at 51, Ruker 45, and Clace at 36 points. For the Express, Rodon at 72, Judge at 44, and Valdez at 40 points. And that has been your Week 17 look back. All right, folks, I want to go ahead and take a look at something new. Since we're getting down to the end of the year and the playoffs and the standings, more on that in a moment. But since we're getting down to that time, I want to go ahead and take a look at some series that are interesting because one of the tiebreakers for the playoffs is the top tiebreaker is head-to-head record, and the second one is points for. So let's go ahead and take a look at that series, some series. We'll start off first with this week's matchup between the Dominators, that's myself, and the Express, that's Ruben. This matchup is tied at 1 apiece. So very interesting. The winner of this one could put themselves in a pretty good position for a playoff run, while the loser could be having to need some help. Just a little crazy, and the Demon Ducks, that's Dan versus Greg. Greg is 2-0 and has won the series. So any tie between these two teams will go to Greg. Let's look at the Wildcats. That's Tammy versus the Chili Dogs. The Wildcats own a 2-0 record and won the series. So any tie between the Chili Dogs and the Wildcats will go to the Wildcats. And the Cubs and Bombers both have won one game. That series is tied at 1 apiece. And let's look at some other ones. The Demon Duck Lindsays versus the Wildcats. That's Tammy. Tammy wins the tiebreaker 2-1 if there's a tie there. The Ducks and the Express are tied at 1 apiece. The Ducks have a 2-1 tiebreaker lead over the Dominators. But here's what's interesting, is there's a game at the end of the year between the Ducks and Dominators. If the Dominators win that game, more than likely they will have a tiebreaker over the Demon Ducks due to points 4, if that holds up right now. If Greg wins that last game, he would own the tiebreaker completely, outright. Dan Ruben's team versus the Express. The Express won that series 2-1. So any tiebreaker there goes directly to the Express. Here's the interesting one that could be one to watch. Dan versus the Wildcats. That's Tammy. Dan is 1-0-1, while the Wildcats are 0-1-1. So the Wildcats need to win that game, and that would be a tie. That would go to points 4. And the Dominators and Dan's Just a Little Crazy are tied at 1 apiece. So now that we got that out of the way, let's go ahead and look at one more. I didn't have this in my notes, but I'm going to go ahead and look at this one more. Bear with me real quick. Give me just a sec, because this is also another crucial tiebreaker between these two. 1-0, 1-1. Okay, so the Express, Ruben versus Tammy, the Wildcats. That series is tied at 1 apiece. So that actually is the game next week. So that's another game crucial for both the Wildcats, Dominators, and the Express. So that could be a winner-take-all series right there, too. And that is a look at some series and where the tiebreaker and what the records are between everybody else on those series. That's been a look at those. Let's take a look at Week 18, what we've got cooking for this week. You've got the Georgia Dominators, that's myself, versus the Atlanta Express, that's Ruben. The Dominators 10-7, the Express 9-8. So this is a very crucial game in the head-to-head tiebreaker. Winner gets a bigger lead. Could help the Express, and it could help them get back on track, or it could kind of start to close their door to a playoff run. You've got Just a Little Crazy at 10-6-1 versus the Demon Ducks at 11-6. And this game right here is a battle for first place in the league right now. If Dan wins, he would move ahead because of that half a game. If Greg wins, he will be ahead about a game and a half over Just a Little Crazy. Then you have the Wildcats, that's Tammy at 9-7-1 versus the Chili Dogs, Ken at 7-10. And then you have the Cubs at 4-13 versus the hottest team in the league right now, the Warner Robin Bombers at 7-10, making a outside run to the playoffs, potentially still down a little bit, but potentially making a big run. And we'll have to see in a minute where they stand on that playoff preview. And now let's go ahead and take a look at the playoff preview. So right now, the number 1 seed, you have the Demon Ducks, that's Greg, at 11-6. At number 2, you have Dan, Just a Little Crazy, at 10-6-1, a half game behind Greg. And like I just said a second ago, that is a 1-2 battle this week for number 1 seed. At number 3, you've got the Dominators, that's myself, at 10-7, 1 game behind Greg. Right now, that that is actually 2 games behind due to the tiebreaker that Greg holds right now with that 2-1 series lead. And then at number 4, you have the Wildcats at 9-7-1, and they're a game and a half behind the Demon Ducks for the top spot. And there's your 4 playoff teams right now. And just on the bubble, your 5th team is Reuben, the Express, at 9-8. He's a half game behind. So a win by him and a loss by the Wildcats, and you flip them for next week. You've got Ken with the Chili Dogs and Jackson, the Warner Robin Bombers, both at 7-10. Both are 2.5 games out. They need, right now, I would say they need a lot of help to get into the playoffs. And then you have the Gatlinburg Cubs at 4-13. And Scotty has managed to be the first team eliminated from the playoffs this year at 4-13, 5.5 games behind the 4th place Wildcats. So I'm sure that'll be something good for the Cubs. They might be firing their manager at the end of the year for another lackluster performance this year. Just throwing that out there for Scotty's team. They may be looking for a new manager. Let's look at the playoff preview. Playoff percentage by ESPN. The Ducks, 94%. Dan, 91%. The Dominators at 82%. The Wildcats at 70%. The Express at 53%. The Chili Dogs at 6%. And the Bombers at 5%. And like I just said a second ago, the Gatlinburg Cubs, 0 and out of here for lunch. And out for the rest of the year, pretty much. Always good. No, seriously though, folks. Right now, your playoff bracket preview, you would have the Wildcats versus the Ducks. And I've already mentioned it a little while ago in the series facts that the Wildcats own the tiebreaker over the Demon Ducks 2-1. So that could be that will be an interesting game. That could be a scary opponent for the Demon Ducks. And you have Dan, just a little crazy, versus the Georgia Dominators. That's myself, Thomas, at 2 versus 3. And that would be a very interesting matchup. That would be a very tight matchup, going down to the wire. And I do want to pull this out. If you do end up having the Demon Ducks, just, throwing some scenarios out, if you have the Demon Ducks 1 versus the Atlanta Express at 4, well, that gets interesting too, considering how both their games came down to the wire. And there's a 1-1 series on that one. That would be very interesting. If you throw Dan against the Express, well, the Express has got a 2-1 lead. Yeah, Dan just clobbered the Express a couple of weeks ago, but still, that would be an interesting matchup, as that always comes down to the wire. You could have another match between the Wildcats and the Dominators. That would be another interesting battle. So a lot of interesting things. We've still got some weeks to go. We still got plenty of games to go. As we've seen all year, you've had one team, whether it was the Wildcats, whether it was the Express, whether it was the Ducks, we've had one team at the top, and they've come back down to the pack. We've had teams coming and going all year, and it says something that you got 5 teams a half game out and 7 teams 2.5 out. I mean, that is really saying how it's kind of, pretty good balanced throughout the whole year. And that has been your look at the playoff preview, the matchups, and all that stuff with the playoffs. Back to you, Scott.
Okay, folks, it's time to take a look at Week 18 Power Rankings, brought to you by East Tennessee Media. Coming in at number 1 spot is Just a Little Crazy Dan at 10-6-1. Followed in the number 2 spot by the Demon Ducks at 11-6. Coming in at number 3 is the Wildcats at 9-7-1. Pay attention to that 1 on the tie. Then you've got the Georgia Dominators at number 4 at 10-7. You've got the Gatlinburg Express falling all the way down to 9-8. Then you've got the Warner Robin Bombers, who has all of a sudden hit a hot streak. They are now 7-10, coming up the list. In the number 7 hole, you've got the Macon Chili Dogs. And then rounding out at the very bottom is the Gatlinburg Cubs at 4-13. That's your Week 18 Power Rankings brought to you by East Tennessee Media. All right, folks, that was your Baseball Now for this week. Interesting look ahead of the playoffs. Thank you, Thomas, for that, as always. And thank you for your Week 19 look ahead and your Week 18 Power Rankings. Thank you for that, Thomas. As always, folks, please make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. And be sure to go on over to YouTube to Cash and Sports and East Tennessee Media. And be sure to subscribe and like to the pages. I'm your host, Scotty. I hope everybody had a great Monday. And we look forward to Thursday for the Bullpen Show with Thomas. And look forward to coming up soon in the college football season. College football is just around the corner. Be on the lookout for Game Day or College Football Fantasy Insight.